Hello everybody, welcome back to Red Tool House. Since this week has been a week of rain here at Red Tool House, I thought maybe this would be an appropriate time to talk about the 100-year floodplain and why it should matter if you're looking to buy land for your farm or homestead. So let's dive in. So this time of year in West Virginia, in the late spring or early summer months, that's when we've got the opportunity to have some pretty extreme storms. Now, we're blessed in West Virginia not to have to worry about tornadoes very much. It's very, very rare for a tornado to show up in West Virginia. And of course, we don't live close to the coast where hurricanes come in and cause an issue usually. But this time of year normally produces some pretty decent storms from West Virginia standards. We can get some pretty kicking thunderstorms simply because the weather patterns, as they move from west to east across the plains and the flatter elevations of Kentucky and Ohio, they tend to dam up when they hit the Appalachian Mountains, and that kind of squeezes everything out. So that can provide some pretty cool thunderstorms and can produce a lot of rain. That's why we get as much rainfall as we do here in West Virginia. So why is it important, or how do you find out if a piece of land that you are thinking about purchasing or have just recently purchased has any flooding issues? Well, truth be told, I think it's fair to say that every piece of land has the potential of flooding. It just depends on the amount of rain. I like this quote from a flood hazard specialist in doing this research, where he said, "In truth, with enough rain, every piece of land has flood potential, and we can't predict the weather very well." So I think it's safe to say that every piece of land, no matter where you're looking, has the potential for flooding. It's the same here on our 100 acres, even though we're high on the watershed. In fact, where I'm standing here at our creek crossing, this is how we get, obviously, on the farm. I've seen the water so deep, it would actually be up to the top of the roll bar of the side-by-side right now. And I used to have a culvert here at one time, and it washed out. So until I can get a much bigger, more sturdy bridge built, then we continue to drive through our creek crossing. Even as high as we are on the watershed, the stream that originates on the back of my property, so that watershed starts there, I've seen roll pretty good. In fact, it'd be a little scary for our chicken house greenhouse at times because it gets pretty high. And then this watershed that I'm standing at begins less than a mile upstream. But even with these heavy rains, I can see these small watersheds really produce a lot of water. So FEMA and a bunch of other smart people got together and they put together this standard that helps all of us, property owners, mortgage companies, banks, and insurance companies, understand exactly the potential land has for flooding. And I say exactly with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there, simply because when you do some research on these floodplain definitions can get a little weird sometimes. But that standard is what's used to determine whether or not land is susceptible or high risk for flooding. So one key standard in what FEMA set is this term called the 100-year floodplain. And it's surprising how misinformed people are on that term, or how it's misused so much. So let's first start, instead of defining what it is, let's define what it isn't, what it doesn't mean. So we'll start there. What the 100-year floodplain doesn't mean is there is a specific time on the calendar that there's going to be this epic flood event, and that time happens every 100 years. It's kind of hard to believe, but we have run into it before where people will even say, well, when's the next 100-year flood due? As if it's scheduled, something somebody put on the calendar. Another thing it does not mean is that the flood event of this magnitude only happens once every 100 years. So instead of being scheduled, maybe it's just, this is an epic event and you really only see it once out of every 100 years. So if we just had one a decade ago, most likely we're not going to have one anytime soon, so you can be okay. It doesn't mean that either. And along the same lines, that the 100-year flood gives us an idea of some sort of predictability, that if we've just had one recently, then yeah, we're not going to have one anytime soon, and there's really X amount that you're going to have. There's only going to be one every 100 years, so once we've crossed that off our list, then we won't have to worry about it in my lifetime. It doesn't mean that. The definition, surprisingly, is pretty simple. It really just means that there's a 1% chance every year to have a flood event at this magnitude. So if we use this example here, when the water was up, well, what would be almost to my chest, would be you'd say that there's a 1% chance of that happening every year, if that indeed was the bar for the 100-year floodplain. We'll get into that in a second. So if you use that example, say there's a 1% chance every year for the water to get this deep on me. That's really all that means. And that's defined by these studies and this research and blah, 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 all the stuff where all these eggheads come together and come up with this idea. So the 100-year floodplain really has nothing to do with 100 calendar years. It's really this 1 out of 100 chance of getting a flood event. So that's why they call it the 100-year floodplain. And there's actually the 500-year floodplain, which is the line set that is a potential of 0.2% or 1 out of 500 chance of the water level being even higher in any given year. So if you're looking for land to buy, why should you even consider? Why is this important, or where does this rank on the importance scale of doing your land research? Well, unless you've lived under a rock, I'm sure you've seen issues associated with flood damage and the mitigation costs that go along with that. If you look at the research, it's a multi-billion-dollar expense annually for the United States. And that bill is usually covered by insurance companies and our federal government, which, you know what that means? It means it's actually covered by us. We're the ones that are paying that, either in higher premiums or our tax dollars at work. So I think it's important, if you're going to be a property owner, you need to know details about flood potential. The 40+ years I've lived in West Virginia, unfortunately, I've had a lot of experience in helping people clean after flood damage. And there is nothing worse than being in a house that's been full of flood water. It's not like the movies where the house fills up with this clean water and you see people diving under to swim from point A to point B to dramatically save whatever, save a friend or something. The water is muddy, the water is filthy, it has so much solid debris in it that you wouldn't even begin to swim in it. It's very deadly to be caught up in it, and then after it recedes, it's an absolute muddy mess, full of pathogens, full of all kinds of concerns there that you don't want to be a part of. So I think it would be best, I always think obviously with videos it's best to have visuals. And since we live so high on the floodplain, we actually don't, our entire piece of property has absolutely no flood listings with it. FEMA has not come this far up the watershed. You have to go almost a mile downstream before the flood zones even start. So it's a non-issue for us. But let's start with an illustration. Let's say you're looking for land and you found this pristine, flat piece of acreage. I mean, it's just so flat and it's got beautiful grasses on it. The soil's incredible. It's nestled around all of these large mountains. And you're like, man, this is pristine. This is great. The acreage price is right on. And there's even this beautiful picturesque river that comes right down the side of it. You think this is the ideal piece of land. This is where I want to start my home or my farmstead. Well, it would be very, very important to know what the potential risks are from that river. What has it done historically, and how does that translate to potential in the future for flooding or inundating that area with water? So probably the most simplest way of understanding floodplains in any land or any example is to break it out in these three main areas. And this is going to be extremely rudimentary, so I know there's a lot of detail to this, but let's start here. This may be the easiest way. First and foremost, you actually have your watershed's channel. So this would be where you'd actually consider water flow to be occurring at most of the time, any given time, even after a slight rain event or even after a winter thaw. And that's usually easy to identify because you can get down in it and say, is there water in it right now? Or even look at the lines along the bank and say, okay, you can see there's no vegetation, there's no soil here, it's bare rock. Water comes through here pretty quickly, and you can pretty much assume where that channel is. So that's an easy one to define. The next is what they call the 100-year floodway. And the floodway is an area that is kind of the next phase in risk for flooding. So maybe annual storms, annual melt-off, all those type of things are always going to flood there. You've got a really, really good chance of seeing the water get up into that. So there could be things like that that are just, you can almost set your watch by. It's okay, this is a floodway. This, at some point, this is going to flood on a regular basis. And right now, usually our government, our U.S. government says, no building, no developing in those. That's a bad idea. In fact, we're going to do what we can to restrict you if we find you trying to build there. And then the third tier is what we've been talking about, this 100-year floodplain. And you may be able to build within this area, but there could be some restrictions or there could be some requirements. Some of which could be foundation adjustments or even fill before you build your structure. So let's go back to our illustration of this perfect piece of land we found with all this beautiful flat acreage alongside the river. But let's say you've done your homework and you've discovered that that entire bottomland is within the 100-year floodplain. That would account for that soil that from time to time water gets up in there and brings in new nutrients and washes things in and doesn't allow forestation to take place. So let's say regardless of the fact that it's a floodplain, you still want to build your house in that bottomland. You think, I want my house in the dead center of this meadow just because it's going to be so gorgeous and it's going to be so high functioning for my farm and all my efforts I want to do. Well, you may be able to do that without any government interference if you build up. So you bring in a lot of fill dirt and you actually build a pedestal or a plateau for your house to sit. And that is a reasonable option in some cases. But there'll be other cases where you're restricted and prohibited from doing so, because if you think about it, when you build a large embankment, you're actually just displacing floodwater. So you're making your problem somebody else's problem. You're pushing water either over on the other side of the river or further upstream. So there'll sometimes be prohibitions or laws that say, no, you can't fill in this area. I mean, the church where I grew up, we had a ball field that set down on the Elk River, and we wanted to fill that area in because it was 30 feet lower in elevation, and we wanted to build it up to still use as a ball field and additional parking because it would flood from time to time. Well, FEMA and all the other people came in and said, no, you can't do that. That keeps the city of Charleston from filling up with water, because that becomes almost like a pressure valve to allow all this water to collect in this huge bottomland and keeps it out of downtown Charleston. So instead of building a large embankment or adding fill dirt, you could possibly come and just build a very large foundation or an unfinished basement. And you'll see that a lot. You see that in coastal areas, and you see that down in the south, where people will build these houses up on stilts, or they just build really tall unfinished basements, and so the main living quarters is above that floodplain. And that passes the sniff test sometimes for the government and insurance agencies. The third option, which is the option I would always recommend if it is indeed an option, is to just simply choose a house location that sits outside of the 100-year floodplain. Now in West Virginia, that's easy for me to say because you can always go up the mountain usually and chisel out a spot in the side of a mountain and build your house and be okay. Now you guys out in the Great Plains and some of those other areas, you don't have that luxury. But if that was an option, that would be the direction I'd always go. So does that mean that whole bottomland in our example is worthless and you can't do anything with it? Well, no, of course not. You could obviously run animals. You could have gardens. You could have crops. You may even be able to build rudimentary structures like a barn or some sort of outbuilding. You just have to be prepared to possibly deal with flooding at some point. If it's a barn, just know that hey, there's a chance your tractor may get 2 feet of water up against it. For me, a lot of that would really be based upon the situation. If it was a swift moving river, so when it floods, instead of it being slow and the water just kind of soaks into everything, it's like what we have here in West Virginia where the water just comes ripping through, and it's not just going to be the water that infiltrates that's the issue you have to worry about. It's the water that infiltrates and is moving at a certain pace that it just starts tearing things out. So your new barn that you built no longer is sitting there, it's sitting downriver in your neighbor's backyard, or it's busted in pieces against a bridge on down the road. We see that all the time in West Virginia, and it's just heartbreaking. Unfortunately, most people's homeowners insurance policies do not cover that. It requires flood insurance, which we'll get to here in a second. So for most people, buying land and building, it normally involves some sort of loan or borrowed money. And of course, that's where everybody gets their hands in the situation and tells you exactly what you're going to do and what it's going to cost you. So if you're in that circumstance and you're going to build in that 100-year floodplain, then you're probably going to have to follow the bank or the insurance company's guidelines. They're going to tell you, fill dirt is what we want you to do, or higher foundation is what we want you to do, or higher foundation plus this flood insurance. And flood insurance can get really expensive by the time you add it to all the other things that go along with buying a house and mortgages and homeowners insurance and that stuff. So it can be an expense that you weren't expecting. It could possibly blow your budget out of the water. Pardon the pun. In the studies I looked at in West Virginia in 2021, the average flood insurance annual premium is just over $1,000. And that's from the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, which I think has a cap at $350,000 total. So if you build a bigger house and you got all this equipment and all those type of things, that may not be enough to cover it. And you may have to seek additional flood insurance policy from a private carrier, which could be even more expensive. But it really varies a lot from state to state, especially when you get away from the NFIP, which is a national federal insurance program. When you look at some of these private things, they're going to do what insurance companies do. They're going to say, what's the cost? How much is it going to cost to replace? What are we looking at? What are the percentages, the chances, all that type of stuff. And that's going to determine your premium. I remember my business partner being quoted $400 a month for his house if he was going to get flood insurance. That was crazy. So here's some advice that I will throw out there that some of you may think I'm just being a nervous Nelly. And again, I'm just speaking from my experience. But if you're in a situation where you're even out of the 100-year floodplain, maybe you're just above it, and you're thinking, well, I dodged the bullet. I don't have to do anything special to my house construction. I don't have to buy flood insurance. I'm okay. Wow, I really dodged a bullet. And I would still consider looking at flood insurance simply because of the experiences I've had and the expenses associated with flood mitigation. First of all, in our area, high elevation, where water moves quick, there's always the chance for loss of life. And that really puts a damper on your homesteading dreams when you're dead. Second, of course, is just the property damage. If you don't have insurance, like I said, most homeowners insurance policies won't cover that. So if it's time to clean up or to rebuild or to repair, replace, that's on your nickel. And that can make you go bankrupt very, very quick, or make you do substandard things that could cause you to become sick later on because of all the mold issues that have developed. And you may be saying, well, isn't there this government agency out there called FEMA that's going to take care of me if I don't have flood insurance, so it's my golden parachute? There is an entity out there that would possibly do that, but I could tell you horror stories from the floods here in West Virginia. You do not want to rely on FEMA to bail you out of anything. Resources are limited. Administration is terrible. Execution is a nightmare. A real quick story, there's not even 2 miles from here, we have what's called the Mud River. And the Mud River gets up from time to time. But over the years, people in looking for low-income housing have moved into some of these smaller houses that these landowners will rent. There's one particular one that sticks in my mind. I won't give any more details because I don't want to pin anybody down. But just in the 20 years I've lived on this property, I've seen water get into that house 3 times. And it's a rented property, so the damage, of course, is incurred by the tenant. So all of their stuff is ruined. They have to throw it away. Well, FEMA comes through every time, puts the big FEMA number on the side with spray paint to say this house is covered by FEMA, it's going to be condemned. Most of the time, it's the property owner that gets the cash. The tenant gets a little, maybe, but the property owner really gets most of the benefit there. 3 times now, and that house still stands and is currently being occupied. And we just had floodwaters 2 nights ago that supposedly got up in that area again. So it could be a 4th time. I haven't driven down there to see. So it could be the 4th time in the 20 years that I've lived here that house has had water in it. And FEMA has come in to bail out the property owner, has quote-unquote condemned the house, but is yet to tear it down. And a couple years it lays fallow, and then the landlord allows somebody else to come in and rent it, which is just a Greek tragedy if there ever was one. So 3 key takeaways from this video and all my aimless ramblings down here by the creek in the shade. Number 1, 100-year floodplain has nothing to do with 100 calendar years. Remember, it's just the chance of a flood of that magnitude happening each year. So don't assume that you're safe because there's been a flood recently. Number 2, it is highly, highly important to look, when you're looking at any property, to look at flooding concerns, floodplains, flood history, do all of that research. And if you see that there's a problem, do not just push that aside and say, well, this property's too good a deal to pass up just because of some little flood issue. Usually there's a reason why it's that good a deal, because there's a flood history there or there's something else. So don't write off flood as a non-issue. Number three, again, depending where you are in the country, you may not be able to escape it. So make sure you have budgeted for not only some of the additional building expenses associated with it, if you've got to build on fill, raise an elevation, a foundation, those type of things, or buy that flood insurance. Make sure you've budgeted that, because you may end up with a piece of land that you can't afford to live on. So I know some of you flatlanders out in the Midwest and along the Mississippi, I just can't comprehend some of the situations you run into. This West Virginia hillbilly loves the fact that I can retreat to higher ground. There's a reason why my house sits up there about 80 feet higher than where I'm standing right now. So that gives me some additional protection, or at least peace of mind. Maybe it's a false sense of peace of mind. But I pray this video helped you all, that there's some discussion there. Comment below what you've run into. I'd be curious to see, as many viewers as we have all across the country and across the world, just what you run into with flood situations and what you've experienced personally. So comment below, share some of your flood stories with us. All right, well, I appreciate everybody watching. Y'all take care.